My daughter-in-law looked my son in the eye and said, "It's time you choose, either your mother or your wife." I didn't say a word. I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and watched. What I did next, they never saw coming. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're listening from." I never imagined a moment like this would unfold at my own dining table. The evening had started so quietly. It was a Sunday dinner, something I had hosted for over 30 years. Even after my husband passed, I kept the tradition alive. The same oak table, the same porcelain plates with the faded blue trim, the same pot roast recipe my son used to beg for when he was a boy. At 71, I didn't ask for much. Just a few hours with my son. A familiar routine, a sense that I still belonged somewhere. The house smelled like rosemary and slow-cooked beef. Soft jazz played from the radio in the corner. I remember adjusting the silverware just slightly, making sure everything was aligned. Old habits don't leave you, even when people do. My son, Daniel, sat across from me. He looked tired, not physically, something deeper. The kind of tired that comes from avoiding things you don't want to face. And beside him was Claire, my daughter-in-law. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect tone, always just a little too controlled. She hadn't liked me from the beginning. I used to think it was just a difference in personalities. That maybe, over time, we'd find our rhythm. But over the past year, something had shifted. She would go quiet when Daniel and I spoke too long. Her eyes would narrow just slightly when he laughed at something I said. Small things, easy to ignore, until they weren't. That night, she barely touched her food. Instead, she watched. Every glance Daniel gave me, every question he asked, every time I reached for the serving bowl and he instinctively helped me. At one point, he said, "Mom, this tastes just like when I was a kid." I smiled. "That's because it is." Claire set her fork down. The sound was soft, but sharp enough to cut through the room. That's when I felt it. The shift. Like the air itself had tightened around us. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers laced together, her expression calm but cold. "Daniel," she said. Not loud, not emotional, just deliberate. He looked at her, confused. "Yeah?" She didn't look at me when she spoke next. But I knew this was about me. "It's time," she said. "You've been avoiding this long enough." The jazz music kept playing in the background. The clock on the wall ticked like nothing had changed. But everything had. Daniel frowned. Avoiding what? That's when she finally turned her head. Her eyes met mine for just a second. And in that second, I understood. This wasn't about dinner. This wasn't about small tensions anymore. This was something she had been building toward. Something she had already decided. She turned back to him. And that's when she said it. "Either me, or your mother." The room went completely still after she said it. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, the kind that presses against your chest. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his hand still resting near his glass, his eyes moving between his wife and me. I didn't help him. I didn't say, "It's okay," I didn't laugh it off. Because deep down, I knew this moment had been coming long before tonight. This wasn't sudden. This was built, slowly, carefully, over months. I leaned back in my chair, the same way I used to when Daniel was little and trying to solve a problem on his own. I had learned early on, if you rush in too quickly, you don't raise a man, you raise someone who depends on being rescued. So I waited. Claire exhaled softly, almost like she was relieved it was finally out. "You see," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This is exactly what I mean. You freeze every time it comes to her." Daniel shook his head. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" she replied, tilting her head slightly. "Every weekend, you're here. Every decision, you check with her. Every time we argue, you run back to this house like nothing else matters." Her words were smooth. Practiced. Not emotional, strategic. I kept my eyes on my plate. But I listened to every word. Because this wasn't just an argument. This was a case she had been preparing. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Claire, she's my mom. And I'm your wife, she said immediately. The person you chose. The person you're building a life with. There it was. Not anger. Positioning. I finally looked up. Not at Claire. At my son. His face, I hadn't seen it like that before. Conflicted, cornered, smaller than he used to be. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not pain. Clarity. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about Claire's jealousy. It was about control. About rewriting what family meant, on her terms. I'm not asking you to abandon her. Claire continued, softer now. I'm asking you to set boundaries. Real ones. Daniel swallowed. What kind of boundaries? She didn't hesitate. No more weekly dinners, no more daily calls, and no more this. She gestured vaguely between him and me. This emotional dependence. Dependence. I almost smiled. 71 years of life, and suddenly, loving your own son had a new name. I reached for my glass of water. My hand steady. Still, I said nothing. Because I needed to hear it. Not from her. From him. Daniel looked at me again. And this time, he didn't look away. That's when I knew. Whatever he said next, would change everything. Daniel took a slow breath. I could see it in his shoulders, the hesitation. The weight of being pulled in two directions. For a second, he looked like the little boy who used to stand in the kitchen doorway. Unsure whether he'd broken something or just imagined he had. Claire, he started, his voice low. This isn't something you just decide like that. Her expression didn't change. I'm not deciding it alone. She said, I'm asking you to choose what kind of husband you want to be. There it was again. Not a request. A test. I watched his fingers tighten around the edge of the table. You're making it sound like I'm doing something wrong, he said. Claire gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. You're not wrong, Daniel. You're just stuck. Stuck. Such a gentle word for something so sharp. I finally spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally. Just enough to exist in the room again. He's not stuck, I said. He's thinking. Both of them turned toward me. Claire's smile faded just slightly. Daniel's eyes softened for a brief second, like he was relieved I had said something. But also afraid of what would come next. I'm not asking him to choose between love and love, Claire said, now looking directly at me. I'm asking him to choose his priority. I met her gaze. Calm, steady. And you believe that means removing me? I replied. She didn't blink. I believe it means creating space where our marriage can exist without interference. Interference. Another new word. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering it. But inside, I was already connecting the pieces. The cancelled visits, the shorter phone calls, the way Daniel had started checking his watch whenever he was here. This hadn't started tonight. Tonight was just where she decided to say it out loud. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the floor. This is getting out of hand, he said, running a hand through his hair. You're talking like my mom is some kind of problem we need to fix. Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'm talking about the fact that every time we try to build something together, she said, there's always a third presence in the room. A third presence. I let that settle. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed everything. I reached for my napkin again, folding it once more, slowly, carefully. Then I looked at my son. Not as someone waiting to be defended, but as someone about to see who he had become. Daniel, I said quietly, she's right about one thing. They both stilled. I held his gaze. You do need to choose. The clock ticked on the wall. The music kept playing. And for the first time that night, I saw fear in Claire's eyes. Daniel didn't answer right away. The air in the room felt heavier than before, like something invisible had settled between the three of us. He looked at me first. Then at Claire. Then back at the table, as if the answer might be written somewhere between the plates and the half-finished dinner. I didn't mean it like that, he said finally, his voice quieter now. I I don't think this should be a choice. Claire didn't move. That's exactly the problem, she replied. You keep pretending it isn't. I watched him closely. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. Just attention. Because moments like this don't just show you what someone says. They show you what they've been thinking for a long time. Daniel leaned back, rubbing his hands together like he used to when he was nervous. You're asking me to cut my mom out of my life, he said. I'm asking you to stop putting her before your life, Claire corrected. Before. After. Above. Below. It was strange how love could suddenly be measured like that. I let out a slow breath and looked down at my hands. These same hands had held him when he was a newborn. Had stayed up nights when he had a fever. Had packed his lunches, ironed his shirts, clapped the loudest at every school event. And now. We were discussing where I ranked. I almost smiled again. Not because it was funny. But because it was clear. Daniel turned to me, his eyes searching. Mom, say something. I lifted my head slowly. I already did, I said. He frowned slightly. That's it? I nodded. Because there was nothing else to explain. No speech. No defense. If he needed someone to argue for their place in his life, then the answer was already there. Claire shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. Impatient now. She thought she had control of this moment. Maybe she had, until now. Daniel, she said, her tone firmer, I need an answer. He looked at her. Then at me. And for the first time that night, I didn't see a boy caught in the middle. I saw a man standing at a line. And whatever he chose next, would tell me everything I needed to know. He straightened slightly in his chair. Took a breath. And opened his mouth. I didn't interrupt. I didn't brace myself either. Because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I wasn't afraid of losing him. I was only afraid of finding out who he really was. Daniel inhaled slowly. Not sharp, not dramatic. Just enough to steady himself. I'm not cutting my mom out, he said. Claire didn't react right away. But I saw it. That tiny flicker in her eyes. The first crack. I didn't ask you to cut her out, she replied, her voice still controlled. I asked you to choose your priority. Daniel shook his head. That's the same thing, Claire. You just said it differently. Silence stretched again. But this time, it felt different. Less tense. More revealing. Claire leaned forward slightly, her hands now flat against the table. Then answer me this, she said. When we argue, whose side are you on? Daniel hesitated. And that hesitation said more than anything else. Because it wasn't confusion. It was calculation. I watched him carefully. Because this was the real question. Not mother or wife. Loyalty. I don't see it as sides, he said finally. Claire let out a short breath. Almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Of course you don't, she said, because you've never had to fight for this marriage. There it was again. Not anger. Pressure. Always pressure. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's not fair. I've been here. I've been trying. Trying? She cut in, her tone sharpening just enough. Trying would mean making decisions. Daniel, not sitting in the middle hoping things just work themselves out. I lowered my gaze again. Not because I felt small. But because I was listening more than speaking now. This wasn't my fight anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Daniel stood up suddenly, his chair pushing back with a harsh sound against the floor. I'm not choosing between you and my mom, he said, his voice firmer now. That's not how this works. Claire stayed seated. Calm. Too calm. That's exactly how it works, she said quietly. You just don't want to admit it. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once beside the table. You're turning this into something it's not. No, she said, looking up at him. I'm finally saying what it's always been. Always been. That phrase lingered. Because it meant this wasn't about tonight. This wasn't about dinner. This was about a story she had already written, long before either of us realized it. Daniel stopped pacing. He looked at me. Really looked this time. And I didn't look away. I didn't soften my expression either. I just sat there. Present. Steady. Not asking for anything. And maybe that was the difference. Because Claire needed an answer. I didn't. Mom, he said quietly. I tilted my head slightly. Yes? His voice dropped, almost uncertain again. You don't think I'm doing something wrong, do you? For a second, I saw it again. The boy. The one who used to need reassurance. The one who used to ask if he'd done okay. And I realized something in that moment. He wasn't asking me for the truth. He was asking me for permission. Permission to stay comfortable. Permission to not choose. I held his gaze. Then I shook my head, slowly. No, I said. Claire's eyes snapped toward me. Daniel let out a breath, relief. Immediate and visible. But I didn't stop there. But you are doing something weak. The word landed quietly. But it didn't need to be loud. Daniel froze. Claire didn't move. And for the first time that night, no one tried to interrupt me. Daniel didn't speak. Not right away. The word weak stayed in the air longer than anything else that had been said that night. He looked at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard it correctly. Weak, he repeated. I nodded. Not harsh, not emotional. Just certain. Yes. Claire leaned back slightly in her chair, her arms crossing slowly over her chest. She wasn't interrupting anymore. She was watching. Daniel swallowed. How is this weak? I'm trying to keep the peace. I shook my head once. Peace isn't something you keep by standing still, I said. It's something you build by making decisions. He didn't respond. Because he understood that. He just didn't like it. You're not protecting anyone right now, I continued. You're just avoiding the moment where someone gets hurt. His jaw tightened. And that moment is here anyway, I added quietly. The clock ticked behind us. Steady, unbothered. Claire uncrossed her arms, leaning forward again. This is exactly what I've been saying, she said, her voice calm but now carrying a different weight. He won't act unless someone forces him to. I didn't look at her. Because this wasn't about proving her right. It was about finishing what needed to be said. Daniel looked between us again. But something had changed. He wasn't searching for an escape anymore. He was starting to feel the corner. I just don't think it's right to frame this like I have to pick one person over the other. He said, slower now, more careful. Then don't frame it that way, I replied. He frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means, I said, folding my hands together on the table. You're not choosing between your mother and your wife. I paused. Let him hear it. You're choosing what kind of man you are. That landed differently. I saw it in his eyes. Not confusion. Recognition. Claire's expression shifted just a little. Not fear, but alert now. Because this wasn't her argument anymore. Daniel exhaled, longer this time. And what if I don't agree with either of you? He asked. You don't have to agree, I said. You just have to decide. Silence again. But not the same silence as before. This one was moving. Daniel looked down at the table, then slowly straightened his back. His shoulders squared in a way I hadn't seen all night. When he looked up again, his eyes were clearer. Not calm, but resolved. He turned to Claire first. I'm not cutting my mom out of my life, he said. Then he turned to me. And I'm not going to pretend this is normal either. That was new. That was the first honest sentence of the night. Claire didn't react immediately. But her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Because now, he wasn't standing in the middle anymore. He was starting to step somewhere. The question was, where? Claire didn't speak right away. That alone told me something had shifted. She studied Daniel's face carefully, like she was trying to figure out if this version of him was temporary or real. You're still avoiding it, she said finally. Her voice was quieter now. But sharper. Daniel didn't sit back down. He stayed standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly on the chair as if he needed something solid to hold onto. "No," he said, "I'm not." Claire tilted her head. "Then answer me clearly." There it was again. Not a conversation. A demand. "Do you put this marriage first, or not?" The words didn't echo. They landed. Heavy, direct, final. I didn't move. I didn't look away. But I also didn't step in. Because this part didn't belong to me. Daniel took a slow breath. I could see the tension in his shoulders, but it wasn't the same hesitation as before. This time, it looked like he was choosing his words carefully. Not to avoid conflict, but to define it. "I chose this marriage the day I married you," he said. Claire didn't nod. Didn't soften. Then act like it. Daniel's hand tightened on the back of the chair. "I am," he said, "just not the way you want me to." That landed. Claire's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Less control. More resistance. "And what does that mean?" she asked. Daniel glanced at me for a brief second. Then back at her. "It means," he said slowly, "you don't get to decide who matters in my life." The room went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't tense. It was clear. Claire let out a small breath through her nose, almost like she was recalibrating. "You're choosing her," she said. Not a question. A conclusion. Daniel shook his head. "No, I'm choosing not to let you turn this into a competition." Competition. The word hung there. Because that's exactly what it had been. For a long time. Claire pushed her chair back and stood up. The movement was controlled, but there was energy behind it now. "You don't see it," she said. "You really don't." Her eyes moved toward me briefly. And for the first time that night, there was no effort to hide it. Not politeness. Not restraint. Just something colder. "She's always in the middle of everything," Claire continued. "Every decision, every plan, every moment that's supposed to be ours." I met her gaze. Calm. Unmoved. Because I knew something she didn't. I wasn't in the middle. She had placed me there. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "That's not true," he said. Claire let out a short laugh, sharp this time. "Then why does it feel like I'm the one being pushed out?" That question stayed in the air. Not because it was right, but because it was real, to her. Daniel didn't answer immediately. And I didn't either. Because for the first time, this wasn't about proving anything. It was about exposing what had already been there all along. Claire looked at him one more time. Her voice lower now. More final. "I'm not living like this, Daniel." Another pause. Then. "You either set the boundary, or I will." And that wasn't a request anymore. Claire's words didn't echo. They settled. Like something already decided. "You either set the boundary, or I will." No one moved. The music had stopped at some point, I didn't even remember when. The house felt quieter than it had all evening. Daniel stood there, still beside his chair. Not pacing anymore. Not hesitating the same way either. This was different. This was the moment where silence would no longer protect him. He looked at Claire. Really looked this time. Not with confusion. Not with guilt. But with something steadier. "What does that mean?" he asked. Claire didn't blink. "It means," she said, "if you won't create distance, I will." There it was. Clear. Cold. Final. I watched my son's face carefully. Because this was the line she had drawn. Not between me and her. Between control and resistance. Daniel exhaled slowly. "And how exactly would you do that?" he asked. Her answer came without hesitation. "We move," she said. "New house. New routine. No more dropping by here. No more calls every day. We build something that's ours." Ours. I almost smiled again. Because I had heard that word before. Not tonight. But in smaller ways. In cancelled visits. In shortened conversations. In the way Daniel had started saying, "I'll check with Claire first." This hadn't just been growing. It had been planned. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. You're asking me to restructure my entire life, he said. I'm asking you to protect your marriage, she replied. Same tone. Same calm. But now, there was urgency under it. Because she could feel it slipping. Daniel shook his head once. No, he said. Simple. Not loud. But final. Claire's fingers tightened again. That's your answer? She asked. That's my answer, he said. Another silence. But this one didn't feel uncertain anymore. It felt exposed. Claire let out a slow breath, her eyes moving between the two of us. Calculating. Adjusting. You think this ends here? She said quietly. Daniel didn't respond. So she continued. You think you can say no, and everything just goes back to normal? Normal. I looked down at the table. At the plates. At the food that had gone cold. There was no normal to go back to. There never had been. Daniel finally spoke again. There is no normal, he said, there's just what we decide to do next. That landed harder than anything else. Because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was clear. Claire stared at him for a long second. Then her gaze shifted. To me. And this time. There was no pretending. No politeness. No performance. Just a quiet acknowledgement. She hadn't lost control because of me. She had lost it. Because he stopped giving it to her. I held her gaze. Calm. Unmoved. Not as an opponent. Not as someone fighting for space. But as someone who no longer needed to. Claire straightened slightly. Then nodded once. Slow. Measured. All right, she said. 2 syllables. But they carried weight. Because they didn't mean agreement. They meant something else. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. I understand, she added. But the way she said it told me she didn't accept it. Not at all. She turned toward the door. And Daniel didn't stop her. That was the moment everything truly changed. The front door closed softly behind Claire. Not slammed. Not dramatic. Just final. The sound echoed through the house longer than it should have. Daniel didn't move right away. He stood there, staring at the door like something might change if he waited long enough. It didn't. I stayed seated. My hands still resting on the table, exactly where they had been. The food between us had gone completely cold now. Neither of us reached for it. After a few seconds, Daniel let out a slow breath and ran his hands over his face. I didn't think it would go like that, he said. His voice was quieter. Not defensive anymore. Just tired. I didn't respond immediately. Because this wasn't the moment for comfort. And it wasn't the moment for blame either. It was the moment for truth. You knew it would come to this, I said. Not harsh. Just steady. He looked at me, a little surprised. I didn't think she'd actually leave, he admitted. I nodded slightly. That's because you thought she needed you more than she needed control. He frowned. Control? He repeated. I held his gaze. Yes. He didn't argue. But I could see it, the part of him that was starting to replay everything. The small things. The comments. The patterns. Daniel pulled out his chair and sat down again. Slower this time. Like the weight of the evening had finally caught up to him. She thinks I don't put her first, he said. She thinks she has to compete, I replied. He shook his head. That's not what I want. I know, I said. And I meant it. Because this had never been about what he wanted. It was about what he allowed. The room fell quiet again. But this silence felt different. Less sharp. More exposed. Daniel looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his plate absent-mindedly. I didn't choose her, he said after a moment. And I didn't choose you either. I watched him carefully. That's not how I see it. He looked up. Confused. What do you mean? I leaned back slightly in my chair. You chose to stop being pushed, I said. He held my gaze. Processing. Slowly. And that's the first real choice you've made tonight. He didn't answer. But I saw it land. Not as relief. Not as pride. Just understanding. The kind that comes a little too late to feel comfortable. After a moment, he glanced toward the door again. You think she'll come back? He asked. There it was. Not about the argument. Not about the truth. About what comes next. I didn't answer right away. Because the honest answer wasn't simple. And it wasn't soft. She will, I said finally. His shoulders relaxed just a little. But I wasn't finished. But not the same way. He stilled. What does that mean? I looked at the empty doorway. Then back at him. It means, I said quietly, she didn't walk out because she gave up. I paused. Let the words settle. She walked out because she's planning her next move. Daniel didn't speak. Didn't look away either. And in that moment, I knew something he didn't. This wasn't over. Not even close. Daniel didn't say anything after that. He just sat there, staring at the table like the answers might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. They didn't. I stood up slowly and began clearing the plates. Same routine. Same movements. As if the evening hadn't just split something open between all of us. The sound of porcelain touching porcelain felt louder now. More deliberate. Daniel watched me for a moment. You don't have to do that, he said quietly. I gave a small nod. I know. But I kept going. Because sometimes, continuing a simple task is the only way to stay grounded when everything else shifts. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I thought saying no would fix it, he admitted. I paused for a second, holding one of the plates in my hand. No, I said, it just revealed it. He didn't respond. Because he understood the difference. I carried the dishes to the sink, turning on the faucet. The steady stream of water filled the silence between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then, my phone buzzed softly on the counter. I didn't rush to it. But I saw Daniel glance at it. He already knew. I dried my hands with a towel before picking it up. A message. From Claire. I opened it. Not quickly. Not slowly either. Just at my own pace. Daniel stood up without realizing it, taking a small step closer. What did she say? He asked. I read the message once. Then again. Not because I didn't understand it. But because I wanted to feel how it was written. Careful. Controlled. Just like everything else she did. I turned the screen slightly so he could see. It wasn't long. Just one message. I think it's best if Daniel and I take some time apart from everything, including you. I'll be speaking with a lawyer tomorrow. Daniel's face changed immediately. Not shock. Not anger. Something heavier. Realization. She's serious, he said. I nodded. She always was. He ran a hand through his hair again, pacing once across the room. This is too much, he muttered. It's too much. I placed the phone back down on the counter. Gently. No, I said, this is exactly what she wanted. He stopped. Turned toward me. What do you mean? I met his eyes. She asked you to choose, I said, and when you didn't choose her the way she wanted, she created a consequence. He frowned. You're saying this is planned? I didn't hesitate. Yes. The word settled between us. Heavy. Uncomfortable. But clear. Daniel shook his head slowly. I don't understand how it got this far. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered. It didn't get this far tonight. I paused. It got this far because every time she pushed a little, you stepped back instead of holding your ground. He didn't argue. Because now. He could see it. The pattern. The silence. The compromises that didn't feel like compromises at the time. Daniel looked down, his shoulders heavier than before. So what happens now? He asked. That question again. But this time, it was different. Less about hope. More about reality. I walked back to the table and pulled out my chair. Sat down. Calm. Steady. You let her do what she's going to do, I said. He looked up. And you? I held his gaze. I do what I should have done a long time ago. He frowned slightly. What's that? I didn't answer right away. Because this part. He wasn't expecting. I stopped being part of a game I never agreed to play. The room went quiet again. But not empty. Not uncertain. Just clear. And for the first time that night, I wasn't waiting to see what they would do next. I already knew what I would. Daniel didn't sit down again. He stayed where he was, standing in the middle of the room like he wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. I didn't realize it was a game, he said quietly. I looked at him. That's because you weren't playing, I replied. You were reacting. He let that sink in. Slowly. Painfully. The house felt different now. Not emptier, just clearer. Like something that had been sitting in the air for months had finally been spoken out loud. Daniel walked toward the window, glancing outside as if he expected to see Claire's car still there. It wasn't. She said she's calling a lawyer. He muttered, that's not just emotional. No, I said, it's strategic. He turned back to me. You really think she planned all this? I didn't answer immediately. Not because I wasn't sure. But because I wanted him to arrive there himself. Think about it, I said, the distance, the rules, the pressure, and now, this. He nodded slowly. Connecting it. Piece by piece. I thought she just wanted space. He admitted. She wanted control over what that space looked like. I corrected. That landed. Daniel sat down finally, but not at the table this time. Just on the edge of the chair, like he wasn't staying long. I don't know what to do, he said. That sentence didn't sound like the boy from earlier. It sounded like a man who had run out of ways to avoid a decision. I leaned back slightly. You already started, I said. He frowned. By saying no? Yes. He shook his head. That doesn't feel like enough. It's not, I said calmly, but it's the first honest thing you've done in a while. He looked down at his hands. Quiet. Thinking. The kind of thinking that doesn't look for an easy way out. What if she doesn't come back? He asked. I watched him carefully. Then you'll find out what she was really building, I said. He didn't like that answer. I could tell. But he didn't argue with it either. Because now. He understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't about keeping everyone happy. That option had already disappeared. The clock ticked again in the background. Steady. Unchanging. Daniel stood up slowly. Not rushed. Not panicked. Just decided enough to move. I should go talk to her, he said. I didn't stop him. I didn't tell him to stay. Because this part wasn't mine to control. If you go, I said, don't go to fix her reaction. He paused. Hand near the door. Then why go? I met his eyes. To tell the truth, without asking for permission. He held my gaze for a second longer. Then nodded. Not fully confident. But no longer unsure. He reached for his keys. Opened the door. And stepped out into the night. The house fell quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like something had finally been put back in its place. I walked back to the table, slowly sitting down in my chair. The same chair I had been sitting in when all of this started. Nothing around me had changed. Same walls. Same table. Same silence. But I wasn't the same woman who had set that dinner. I folded my hands together. Looked at the empty seat across from me. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to choose me. I had already chosen myself. The house stayed quiet long after Daniel left. Not heavy. Not empty. Just still. I didn't turn the lights off right away. I let them stay on, casting that soft, familiar glow across the room. The same room where I had spent decades building a life, one dinner. One conversation, one quiet moment at a time. I finished cleaning the table slowly. Plate by plate. Glass by glass. Not because it needed to be done immediately, but because it gave me time to feel what had just happened. Not the argument. Not Claire's words. But the shift. For years, I had been adjusting. Making myself smaller in ways I didn't even notice. Speaking less, asking less, accepting more. Telling myself it was normal. That this is what happens when children grow up. But tonight, I saw it clearly. There's a difference between letting go and being pushed out. I dried the last plate and placed it back in the cabinet. Everything in its place. Finally, I walked back to the dining table and sat down again. The same seat. The same view. But it didn't feel the same. Across from me, Daniel's chair was empty. Claire's chair was empty. And for the first time, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like truth. My phone buzzed again on the table. I glanced at it. A message from Daniel. I opened it. I talked to her. I told her I won't choose between you. I don't know what happens next, but I meant what I said tonight. I read it once. Then again. Not searching for reassurance. Just acknowledging it. I typed back slowly. You didn't choose between us. You chose who you are. That matters more than anything. I set the phone down. No long conversation. No back and forth. Because this wasn't something I needed to control anymore. He would walk his path. And I would walk mine. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a quiet breath. Outside, the night had settled in completely. Still, calm, certain. And I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everyone agreeing. Not the kind that comes from avoiding conflict. But the kind that comes from standing exactly where you are, and not needing to move. Claire had asked him to choose. She thought it would break something. Maybe it did. But not the way she expected. Because what broke was the illusion. That love needed to compete. That presence needed permission. That I had to fight to remain in my own family. I didn't. I never did. I stood up from the table one last time and turned off the light. The room faded into darkness. Quiet. Complete. And as I walked toward my bedroom, I didn't feel like someone who had lost her place. I felt like someone who had finally stopped giving it away.